One city, three religions, 5,000 years of history. Jerusalem, without doubt, the most revered holy city in the world. For millennia, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have each laid claim to this sacred ground, making it the most disputed and fought-over place on earth. Jerusalem has changed hands no fewer than 40 times, conquered by empires, kingdoms, and religious movements. But how did this ancient settlement, which began as little more than a village around a water spring, become one of the most religiously and politically contentious places in human history? This is the extraordinary story of how Jerusalem became the world's holiest city. Our journey begins 5,000 years ago in 3000 BC. In a barren and arid landscape, there was one precious resource that would change everything: the Gihon Spring. This major water source enabled Jerusalem's earliest inhabitants to transform an otherwise lifeless wilderness into what would one day become one of the most important cities in the world. By around 2000 BC, Jerusalem lay just beyond the borders of the Middle Egyptian kingdom. It was during this period that the first known written mention of the city, Jerusalem, was recorded in Egyptian documents. The city itself was occupied by a people known as the Canaanites, who had built a large stone wall around the settlement to protect its most valuable resource, water. By 1500 BC, the city had come under the rule of the Egyptian New Kingdom as a vassal state, forming part of a vast empire that stretched from the Sahara Desert all the way to the borders of what is now modern Turkey. The power of the Egyptians began to decline by the 12th century BC during a period of history known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. This catastrophic era saw many of the great empires and civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean fall into rapid and often violent decline. In their wake arose many smaller, independent kingdoms across the region. One of these new kingdoms was that of the Israelites, a faction of the Canaanites who, according to biblical tradition, were led by King David. Around 1000 BC, David came to occupy Jerusalem, making it the capital of the new kingdom of Israel. For the first time, Jerusalem became more than just a settlement. It became a seat of royal power and the center of an emerging nation. During the reign of David's successor, King Solomon, a grand temple, later known as the Temple of Solomon, was constructed within the city. This magnificent structure cemented Jerusalem's status as a major cultural and religious site for what would evolve into the Judaic religion. The temple became the spiritual heart of the Jewish people, housing the Ark of the Covenant and serving as the center of worship. Within a century, however, the kingdom of Israel had split in two. The northern half remained under the name Israel, whilst the southern half became the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. Over the next 400 years, Jerusalem developed as the epicenter of Jewish faith and culture, yet it faced frequent attacks by more powerful neighbors, namely the Egyptian and Assyrian kingdoms, both vying for dominance across the region. Then, in the 6th century BC, Jerusalem experienced the first of what would be several pivotal transitions of power in its history. The successor to the powerful Assyrian Empire in the region was the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar II. He sought to expand his territorial holdings and successfully besieged Jerusalem in 597 BC. Despite taking the city, the Babylonians faced significant resistance from the local Jewish population, which ultimately led to a rebellion just over a decade later in 587 BC. In response, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem once more and destroyed much of the city, including Solomon's temple. This act of retribution was furthered by his order for the expulsion of the city's Jewish inhabitants, who were subsequently exiled to parts of Babylonia in the east. Jerusalem's Jewish population was torn from their homeland, their temple destroyed, their identity shattered. Jerusalem remained part of the Babylonian Empire for the next 40 years, until it was absorbed by the rapidly expanding Persian Empire under King Cyrus the Great. In a remarkable act of tolerance, Cyrus allowed many of the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their city, including its temple. Over the following 200 years, further waves of exiled Jews and their descendants returned to Jerusalem. However, they still did not control the city for themselves. It remained under Persian rule. In 332 BC, possession of Jerusalem changed hands yet again, when Alexander the Great conquered it as part of his campaign against the Persian Empire. Alexander's reign over the enormous empire that he carved out for himself was nevertheless short-lived. Following his death in 323 BC, his empire was divided amongst his generals. Jerusalem initially fell under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. However, following several centuries of almost constant warfare, it passed into the control of the Seleucids in 198 BC. Starting under Alexander's reign and continuing under the subsequent Ptolemaic and Seleucid rule, many Jews within Jerusalem became adopters of Greek culture. This shift away from traditional Judean practices eventually provoked unrest. During the 160s BC, this unrest erupted into outright rebellion, led by a Jewish group known as the Maccabees. They captured Jerusalem in 164 BC and restored Jewish worship at the temple, an event still celebrated today in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Following what became known as the Maccabean Revolt, Jerusalem became the capital of a semi-autonomous region, and later formed the center of the fully independent Hasmonean kingdom, which lasted for well over a century. This period of independence came to an end in 37 BC following the rise of Herod the Great, who captured the city and established his reign as a client king of the rapidly expanding Roman Republic. Within just 30 years, the Roman Republic absorbed the city of Jerusalem as part of the province of Judea, which it now governed under direct rule. During its incorporation under Roman rule in the early 1st century CE, Jerusalem's population reached an estimated 70,000 to 100,000 people, the vast majority of whom were Jewish. Yet a small but growing minority had become converts to a new sect of Judaism that had emerged within the city following the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. As a result, Jerusalem became the birthplace of early Christianity, with the apostles spreading the teachings of Jesus and establishing the faith's first churches, which expanded across the region in subsequent years. Jerusalem's status as a center of religious worship, however, brought with it its own set of problems. The Roman authorities, who still practiced a form of paganism, viewed both Judaism and the nascent Christianity as threats to their rule, and consequently introduced suppressive measures on religious practice. In the year 66 CE, the Jewish population of Judea rose up in rebellion against Roman rule, sparking the First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Revolt. Jerusalem was the epicenter of the rebellion and therefore attracted the full force of Rome's brutal response. Following a 5-month siege in 70 CE, the Roman legions reconquered the city and destroyed much of it. In an effort to stamp out any future challenges to their authority, the Second Temple was razed to the ground, leaving only its great external walls, a surviving portion of which, now known as the Western Wall or Wailing Wall, remains as a sacred site in Jewish worship to this day. Following its destruction, Jerusalem was rebuilt as the Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina, with the Jewish people themselves being explicitly forbidden entry into the settlement, with the exception of a few select holy days. This led to another revolt by the Jews in 132 CE, which was brutally suppressed by Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian went on to intensify the Romanization of the city by constructing a forum and a temple dedicated to Jupiter on the site formerly occupied by the Jewish temple. With the expulsion of Jews from the city, Jerusalem became a center of predominantly Christian worship. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, himself a convert to Christianity, sent his mother Helena to Jerusalem to locate the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. The area that she subsequently identified was occupied by the Roman temple built under Hadrian. This was promptly pulled down, and in its place the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was constructed in the year 335 CE. Which from that day forth became the focal point of Christian worship within the city.
By the turn of the 5th century, the Roman Empire had begun to decline.
Although its eastern territories remained relatively intact.
The Byzantine Empire, which emerged as the spiritual successor to Rome, maintained control of Jerusalem for nearly 300 years and championed its position as the holiest place within Christendom.
Jerusalem flourished as a center of Christian pilgrimage, learning, and worship.
Churches, monasteries, and hospices were built throughout the city to accommodate the constant flow of pilgrims from across the Christian world. Jerusalem, flourishing under Byzantine grace.
However, an entirely new power, as well as an entirely new religion, was about to leave its mark upon the holy city. The emergence of Islam within the Arabian Peninsula at the outset of the 7th century ushered in a new chapter in Jerusalem's history. The city quickly gained sacred significance for Muslims, as it was believed that the Prophet Muhammad had journeyed there in a single night during the miraculous night journey. Following Muhammad's death in the year 632, the Rashidun Caliphate united the Muslims of Arabia and began to spread Islam across the region. In 638, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab led his Muslim armies to the gates of Jerusalem and successfully captured it from the Byzantines. Despite being under Muslim rule, Jerusalem flourished as a city of remarkable religious tolerance, where freedom of worship was granted to all inhabitants, regardless of faith. Although it retained a predominantly Christian population, the Islamic Caliphate allowed Jews to return and worship freely in the city, thereby lifting the nearly 300-year ban imposed by the Romans and Byzantines. Within just over 100 years, under the governance of the successor Umayyad dynasty in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, Jerusalem gained two of Islam's most important and sacred sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Completed in 691 CE, the Dome of the Rock became one of the most iconic buildings in the world. The construction of these sites not only elevated Jerusalem's status to rival other holy cities like Mecca and Medina within the Muslim world, but it also firmly established Islam as an integral part of Jerusalem's identity, alongside the other two Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity. As the dawn of the new millennium approached, the era of religious tolerance in Jerusalem began to wane. In 969, the Fatimid Caliphate captured Jerusalem as part of their conquest of Egypt and Syria. Christian and Jewish pilgrims were still permitted to visit the holy city, although with time, the Fatimid administration increasingly began to impose restrictions and persecute non-Muslim communities. One infamous event occurred in 1009 when Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world.
By mid-century, Christianity itself was divided by the Great Schism of 1054 between Rome and Constantinople.
By the late 11th century, Jerusalem fell to the Seljuk Turks in 1073, who had expanded across the Middle East from Central Asia. Seljuk rule introduced a period of political and social disruption, with reports reaching Europe that Christian pilgrims were being harassed on their way to visit holy sites. In 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexios III Komnenos requested military assistance from the Christian West against the Seljuks. Pope Urban II reinterpreted this message at the Council of Clermont as a call for a holy crusade to reclaim Jerusalem in the name of Christendom. Motivated by faith and the promise of spiritual reward in heaven, thousands of European knights and commoners embarked on the nearly 2,000-mile journey to the Holy Land, across Europe and Asia Minor,
facing hardship, battles, and endless trials along the way. Until, at last, they reached the walls of Jerusalem, as Huntwaling, the Holy Land itself.
Meanwhile, the Fatimids briefly recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks in 1098. However, just over a year later in June 1099, the army of the First Crusade reached the city's walls and began a siege lasting several weeks. On the 15th of July, the Crusaders successfully breached the walls and then unleashed a massacre upon the city's inhabitants, practically wiping out the Muslim and Jewish populations. It remains one of the darkest chapters in Jerusalem's already blood-stained history. Following the conquest of Jerusalem, most Crusaders returned home to Europe, although a small number chose to remain behind and help establish the Kingdom of Jerusalem, one of several Christian Crusader states that emerged in the region. Within the city, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt in a Western Romanesque style, whilst the Muslim shrines on the Temple Mount were repurposed for Christian use. Several Christian military orders were founded, including the Knights Hospitaller and the legendary Knights Templar, who established their headquarters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. European pilgrims began flooding into the Holy Land as fortified Crusader castles and strongholds took shape across the region. Although the Crusaders had secured control of Jerusalem, their grip over the wider region weakened in the following century with the rise of Saladin, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin sought to restore Muslim dominance over the Holy Land, and after winning a decisive victory over the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin in July 1187, he moved his forces to recapture Jerusalem. After a week-long siege, Jerusalem fell to Saladin in October. Under his rule, many of the Christian sites in the city were either destroyed or converted into Islamic buildings. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was spared but handed over to the Greek Orthodox Church.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was spared but handed over to the Greek Orthodox Church.
News of Jerusalem's fall to the Muslims prompted the call for the Third Crusade in 1190.
Led by King Richard the Lionheart of England and King Philip II of France. This expedition restored much of the Crusader states' territories in the region, but ultimately failed in its primary objective of recapturing Jerusalem. In the 13th century, control of Jerusalem remained a source of conflict between Christians and Muslims. Although the Crusaders were able to retake the city between 1229 and 1244, their efforts were ultimately in vain. The last Crusader state was driven out of the Holy Land in 1291, following the rise to prominence of the Islamic Mamluk Sultanate across the region. The age of the Crusades had ended, leaving Jerusalem firmly in Muslim hands. Under the Mamluks, Jerusalem continued to attract pilgrims of all faiths, though the Christian and Jewish populations of the city were by now greatly diminished. After some 300 years of Mamluk rule, Jerusalem became part of the Ottoman Empire in 1516. During the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the city's walls were rebuilt, the very walls we see surrounding the old city today, ushering in a period of relative religious tolerance, with synagogues, churches, and mosques all peacefully coexisting in close proximity. By the 19th century, Jerusalem had become little more than a provincial backwater within the Ottoman Empire, with a population of barely 8,000 people. The city's inhabitants, comprising Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Armenian Orthodox Christians, lived within their respective but not wholly exclusive quarters. Ottoman rule over Jerusalem was largely uneventful, and as time passed, the city gradually lost its significance, experiencing a period of general decline and economic stagnation into the 18th century. As the 19th century progressed, the Ottoman Empire began to show signs of decline, prompting the European powers to look eastward in anticipation of filling the emerging power vacuum. Many nations re-established a presence within Jerusalem, constructing new churches, consulates, and other institutions. This renewed interest in the city was not just confined to European Christians, for European Jews also began returning to Jerusalem. Many who were fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe formed a steady stream of immigrants to the city who wished to worship freely in what was perceived as their ancestral homeland. By the 1860s, Jerusalem remained confined to an area of just 1 square kilometer and was becoming increasingly overcrowded. This led to calls for the construction of a new city outside the ancient walls. New Jewish settlements began to appear beyond the confines of the old city, largely driven by figures such as Sir Moses Montefiore and Judah Turo, who spearheaded calls for the Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland and build a new state for themselves with Jerusalem at its center. By 1882, some 25,000 Jewish immigrants had arrived, who began to significantly alter the religious demographics of the region. With the dawning of the 20th century, the impending collapse of the Ottoman Empire was finally brought about due to the events of the First World War. In 1917, British forces captured Jerusalem from the Ottomans, bringing the city under direct military rule. However, the British found themselves facing an unforeseen dilemma. In the same year they took Jerusalem, they issued the Balfour Declaration, pledging support for the formal establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In conjunction with this, they had also previously promised an independent state to the Arabs of the region in exchange for their military assistance against the Ottomans during the war. To address these two competing claims for respective independent states, the British established Mandatory Palestine in 1920, and later secured a mandate from the League of Nations to govern the territory in 1922. Over the following 25 years, Jerusalem's population surged from 52,000 to over 165,000, comprising approximately one-third Arabs, predominantly Muslim, and two-thirds Jews, who were arriving in ever-increasing numbers from across the global Jewish diaspora. As a result, relations between the Arabs and Jews quickly deteriorated, and the city bore witness to numerous riots during the 1920s. The unrest escalated throughout the 1930s and 1940s, with both communities increasingly resorting to violence. The violence culminated in the United Nations General Assembly's decision on the 29th of November 1947 to partition Mandatory Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, in a bid to avert any further religious tensions. Jerusalem was to fall under international control as a neutral zone. However, the two-state solution failed to prevent the subsequent conflict it had sought to avoid. Civil war broke out in Palestine, with Jerusalem becoming a major battleground during the siege of 1947. The fighting only intensified following the withdrawal of British forces in May 1948 and the formal establishment of the State of Israel, which resulted in the conflict widening across the region with the Arab-Israeli War. Following 9 months of bitter and largely inconclusive fighting, the former British Mandate of Palestine, as well as the city of Jerusalem, was divided among the combatants. The western half of the new city became part of Israel, while the eastern half, including the Old City with all its holy sites, was occupied by Jordan. This division entrenched further tensions between the Jews and Arabs, which would set the stage for further conflict over the remainder of the 20th century. Despite the repeated efforts of people from all faiths around the world to find a peaceful resolution to the situation in Jerusalem, as well as the wider region of the Middle East as a whole. The centuries-old struggle over who controls the world's holiest city continues to evoke passionate claims from all sides. Today, Jerusalem stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for both profound faith and tragic conflict. For 5,000 years, this city has been conquered, destroyed, rebuilt, and fought over more than any other place on earth. 40 times Jerusalem has changed hands, empires have risen and fallen, temples have been built and destroyed, millions have died in its name. Yet through it all, Jerusalem endures, sacred to Jews as the site of their ancient temples and the heart of their ancestral homeland, sacred to Christians as the place where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, sacred to Muslims as the site of Muhammad's night journey, and home to the Dome of the Rock. 3 faiths, 1 city, 5,000 years of history, and the story of Jerusalem, the world's holiest city, continues to unfold before our very eyes.